Not going to talk about anything I did this morning. It just helps me to frame it a little bit. So this morning I talked about a lot of the promise and opportunity that we have for bringing modern technology into the education process. And I decided I have a very short time here, but I'm going to give you a snapshot into the dangers of technology, largely in the fact that how it interacts with our minds. So actually I have a book coming out on this topic, not for a year from now, but I'm just going to give you a snapshot of a couple of the concepts that I work on in my laboratory and that are going to be included in this book. And the general idea is technology is wonderful in so many ways, as I know you all appreciate, but how does it, if there's a little bright in here, but this is someone crossing traffic, checking their cell phone over here. And so the question is, how does our modern, wonderful world of technology interface with our brain in potentially harmful ways, and especially how that interacts with the classroom and education? Before I move on, it's important to pause and talk about the brain for a moment and realize that it is the most extraordinary, complex structure that we know in the universe, right? It's capable of incredible rapid processing. Within the order of a tenth of a second, you're able to classify and categorize events around you. It could store 1 billion bits of information across your lifetime. That's 50,000 times the information stored in the entire U.S. Library of Congress. And although it looks very small, it's actually a massive structure. So the brain, this is an image of the Milky Way, has over 100 billion neurons, which is on the level of stars in the core of our galaxy. And even more impressive than the number of neurons in the brain is this amazing network that we have of interactivity, which is on the orders of hundreds of trillions of connections. Our brains are phenomenal. I don't have to give you a lot of facts for you to appreciate it. Just pay attention to the fact that everything you do, every thought you have, every emotion you feel, every sensation, every movement is all a product of how our brain works. And despite this, our brains have some very distinct limitations, and raises the question of what happens when this interacts with our brain. And that's what I'm going to give you a quick snapshot today of why this, as amazing as it is, poses a great challenge to our brain, and especially the brains of young people who are in our education system. One of the main challenges is because this is how a lot of people use technology today. So I don't have to describe this in great detail, but you're probably aware that most young adults multitask many different forms of media. 95% of young people multitask media each day, some of them up to 6 or 8 different forms of media at any given time. So you could see, listening to music while being on Facebook, having Twitter open, maybe the TV on, all while doing their homework, right? So this is a very real-world situation, and it doesn't seem like it's going to decrease. So what we want to understand is a little bit of why this is so challenging and some of the limitations that our brain has that causes this to be a burden. To do that, we have to first step back to the earliest brains, primitive brains. And what you're looking at here is a picture of a rat's brain. And information comes into the brain through the back. This is true of us as well. And then the front part of your brain is how you do actions. And so how brains evolved were really to do one simple thing, is to take in information called perception, and then use that to guide our actions. It changes the world around us, changes our perception, leads to new actions, which cycles back and creates new perceptions. This is how the brain works. It was really to guide us on sources of food and reproductive advantage. And so that's the basic model of a brain, is what we call the perception. You take in information, and then you act. The perception-action cycle. And our brain still acts largely this way. However, the biggest advance of the human brain is that we've been able to pause this cycle. So you don't have to react reflexively to everything that is presented to you. You get to insert your goals in there. And maybe your goals are not to react, to ignore. And this is a very human state, is this ability to allow our goals to guide how we interact in the world. How do we do this? We use a set of abilities that we call cognitive control. And these abilities allow us to interact in a complex world around us based on our goals. And there's really 3 main abilities that do this. The first is called selective attention. So you can guide your attention, almost like shooting an arrow where you want your attention to focus, and suppress all the irrelevant information around you. The other thing we can do is what's known as working memory. Hold information in mind for very short periods of time. So if you're engaged in a conversation and someone says something to you and the other person is talking, you're holding this in mind. And so you use working memory all the time. Every one of your interactions involves this online memory. And the last is what we call goal management. This falls into two main categories: multitasking, which, as you probably realize, is very hard for our brains to do, and task switching. So you might have more than one goal that have to be managed. So these basic skills are how we interact with the world around us. The front part of our brain, known as the prefrontal cortex, is what enables this to happen. And it does that through connections or networks with the rest of the brain. The prefrontal cortex, interestingly enough, is the last part of our brains to have evolved. It is what makes us most human. And I think of what's probably the most relevance to this group is that it is also the last part of our brains to develop. So what you're looking at here are MRI scans of children from age 5 to age 20. And the blue areas, the cooler areas, are more developed, and the less mature areas are the warmer colors, the reds and the yellows. And so you can see that from 5 to 20, even over here in teenagers, there's still a lot of undeveloped part. This is the front part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex. And that is why even teenagers, as you probably are aware of, are not very good at cognitive control. Right? They don't really bring their goals to bear in the way that they might want to. And so this is the last part. You could see even at 20, there's still undeveloped areas. And so for children especially, anything that involves challenging their goals is a weakness for them. And you already know this, especially as educators. However, the interesting thing is that it's actually a weakness for all of us in many ways. So this is sort of one of the models that I'm building for this book, is that we have very fundamental limitations on our cognitive control abilities. So, first of all, selective attention. We are all subject to distraction. How we evolved is to be sensitive to the environment around us. This had an advantage in our survival if you smell an animal or a predator. But however, this is not gone. We still have a susceptibility, thankfully, to bottom-up information, the environment coming in on and influencing how we perceive the world. So we're still distractible. Even though we have attention, we're distractible. Also, we have this ability to shoot our attention like an arrow, but we don't have the ability to throw it out as a net. So we have to choose what we pay attention to. So this is a limitation in our attention. We have limitations also in our working memory. We can only hold so much information in mind. So for digits, around 7 to 9. But it gets less and less as the information gets more complex. So for words, maybe 4. For objects, 3. For faces, maybe even only a single face can you hold in mind. So although working memory is necessary to allow us to interact, it's very limited in all of us, and it gets lower as we get older. The other thing is goal management. Our brains do not do very well with trying to have more than one task being accomplished at the same time. What normally happens is that even if you're unaware of it, your brain moves between two tasks. It switches. And with every switch, we have something in our world that we call a cost. And that means with a switch, the information becomes degraded and there's a time delay. And so while you're trying to do multiple things at the same time, what happens is that there's a decrement in the performance on each of those tasks. So what happens is our brains have these limitations, but then we have these goals. These goals, our most human quality, comes along and collides headfirst with our limitations. So although we have these limitations, our goals might lead us to try to overcome them. When that happens, we have something that's called interference. And interference is really the core of what many of us, including many, many children, feel in their lives, is an interference of their goals colliding with the limitations of their brains. And interference can occur in several different domains. So it can occur internally or externally. So external interference, we divide into two categories. The first is distraction. So this is information that's irrelevant around you that you're trying to ignore. So like that. Right? You probably hear it a lot more now that I pointed it out because you were suppressing it in your goal of focusing on me. But if you're in a very noisy restaurant, in some situations, it's very hard to suppress this irrelevant information. The other type of interference we call interruptions or multitasking. It's when you choose to do multiple things at the same time. And so that's an interference in our primary goal. All of this can happen inside your brain. You don't need any interference in the outside world. So we call this type of interference internal distractions or mind wandering, and then you can multitask inside your mind. So maybe right now you're doing that. You're paying attention to me, but you're also planning where you're going to have dinner tonight. And so all of these forms of interference degrade our performance. And if we look at it very globally, we see that interference has a negative impact on our cognition. And we've studied this in our lab for quite a while now. So if you look at perception, decision-making, memory, working memory, and emotion, all of these domains have an impact of interference caused by our goals that interact with the limitations of our brain. If you look beyond cognition into the real-world behavior, you see, again, many, many different areas of impact. Safety, fitness, relationships, education itself, and career. Safety is such a commonly discussed one. I'm not sure of the local laws here, but in the U.S. and California, where I live, you're not allowed to text and drive. Is that true here as well? So we now know that our brains just don't handle this very well, and in order to protect society at a high level, we have to establish laws. But we know that this interference degrades all of our interactions. So when we talk about all the promise of technology and education, it's responsible to be aware that it also could create interference and have detrimental actions as well, and that's worth thinking about. And so the information age, as amazing as it is and as many opportunities as it's open, has created new challenges in terms of interference and how our brain performs at the highest level. And it's not just multitasking. One thing is that our constant access to communications, to computers, to data has really changed expectations. So now when you get a text and you feel it in your pocket, even though you know that you shouldn't be doing it right now, maybe you're in a lecture, maybe you're in a conversation, at dinner, maybe you're driving, it still just sits in your mind and you feel this need that you're expected to reply as fast as possible. I see some nodding out there, and it's sort of embarrassing, but you know it's true. And then there's also that this immediate responsiveness and productivity is expected. So you go on vacation, and yet the moment you have a second to get an email signal, you know, an internet signal, you check your email. And so all of these aspects of the information age, which has unlocked a tremendous opportunity for us, has created very real challenges. Our technology now doesn't wait for you to check it. It can tell you that it wants to be checked through tapping on you like a vibration. So this is a whole new form of interference that we have not evolved to deal with, and it needs to be understood. So this is where we don't have much time to go into more detail, but it raises some interesting questions of how do we deal with all this. We are beginning to understand why it occurs and what its consequences are, but we still have a lot of open-ended questions about how do we manage all of this. And I think there's really two main ways that we can resolve this conflict that occurs in our brain. The first is to change our behavior. And this is obviously easier said than done. You see many, many different troubles with trying to change behavior when it comes to diet and exercise and other aspects of safety. So we know that it's not easy to change behavior, but I think that with awareness of the limitations in our brain and that this interference exists, we have a better chance of it. And that's something that we're working on developing for this book of how we might change our behavior to make it more efficient and less interference in how we interact with the world around us. The other is that we could change our brain, hopefully not in a scary way like in this picture, but maybe more along the way that I described in my talk earlier today, that we can use technology itself as a tool to strengthen our brain so that we can deal with interference more effectively. It would be very unlikely, I think, that it will make interference go away, but at least we'll have the maximal advantage in order to interact with such a complicated world that we live in. And I think that's it. I want to thank you for your attention and then open it up for some questions. Thank you. So, do you have any questions? Okay. I really did not go into so many details at the end because I wanted this to be more of a discussion, but I did want to throw out some points to you there that I think are relevant to to thinking about how the brain works and how it's limited. I'm also happy to entertain any questions. I know a lot of you were at my talk and some weren't, but if you ask me a question related to my talk this morning, I'll quickly give the background and then fill the rest of you in.
What do you think? Is it possibility become a norm for individuals to have multiple degrees with multiple disciplines? For example, let's say a neurosurgeon with maybe also an electrician, qualified electrician, maybe also a part-time sumo wrestler. And
to have multiple degrees.
Yeah, multiple qualifications.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think that our brains are capable of achieving many, many things, but there are limitations on what we can perform, what level. So sure, I think it's possible, and I think some people are better at it than others, but there'll still be interference, and there'll still be an inability to do everything equally well, I would say.
You spoke about the front of the brain, the role that the front of the brain plays, and the back of the brain, and we've seen like many posts where where you take an IQ test and it tells you whether you got a right brain or a left brain, and things like the right brain means you're more creative, left brain means you're probably are more theoretical. So I want to ask you whether it's true, and second, whether is somebody already born with that, with certain characteristics of the brain, like through genes, or is that something that one develops?
Sure. Okay, so I'll answer that. It's a really two-part question. The first is about being left brain to right brain. We don't think about it that way from the science perspective. There are specialties in different parts of your brain. The biggest specialty is that the left part of your brain is in almost everyone, is where language takes place, both receiving language and expressing language. That's not true of everyone, but it's true of like 90% of people. And there is some spatial parts of how you look at the world that's more dominant on the right side. But for the most part, I tend to think that some of the concepts about personality and the brain, left and right-handed, are overstated from what I see in the scientific literature. What is clear is that the front part of your brain is the output part of your brain, and the back part of your brain is the receiving part of your brain. So the occipital, the visual area, the somatosensory, the hearing area, and then the front part is the motor area, and the prefrontal cortex, which is in some way the highest, most evolved part of motion and of action in general. And that's true for everyone. Now, our brains have lots of individual variability, and a lot of it is dictated by genetics. But we know convincingly that how you interact with the world around you will shape your brain through the process of plasticity, which was really one of the main points of my talk this morning, that our brains have the ability to modify themselves, the structure, the chemistry, the function, all in response to how you interact with the world around you. So this is the underlying basis of learning, in that the brain evolves and can develop itself through experience. And we know that this does not end with childhood, and that's why I think the whole concept of education is really a lifelong process, because we know that your brain is constantly able to keep evolving and learning. And so you're both a product of your genes and your environment. I'll tell her.
So picking up on your lecture this morning, so what I took out was that using cognitive science, you're starting to design effectively video gaming or gaming environments which develop particular therapeutic responses, behaviours or ways of being. So it seemed to me the flip side of that is, I know there's the debate about war games, for example, in the video space, which I don't think were developed with cognitive science as their underpinning. So isn't it then true that those games could have developed pathological behaviours and responses unwittingly and unknowingly?
It's certainly possible. So those games, the first-person shooter games, interestingly enough, have been shown in many experiments to improve cognitive abilities in the young adults that play them. They certainly were not intended for that purpose. They're entertainment value, but because their environments of the game are so rich and challenging and motivating, and the degree for like very detailed attention and then broad attention and moving between multiple events, it does seem to actually train the brain unwittingly, not by its intention. But that opens up the possibility that games could have negative effects on behavior as well. And so it seems like, you know, there's two sides to that coin. It's not my area of expertise, so I don't feel comfortable speaking strongly about it, but if you look in the literature and at the impact of violence in video games on behavior, it's a very, very mixed view. Some people feel that it does lead young adults to be a little bit more aggressive. Others feel that it's impossible to tell because there's so much exposure to violence in every form of art that it's really impossible to tease it apart. And so I think it's an open-ended debate. From my own point of view, when we develop games in our own laboratory that are focused at improving the brain, whether therapeutically or for education, we tend to see if we can develop without violence, just because it has the potential, I would say. And we think that we can make games exciting, even for young boys that don't have violence in them, which is the main market for those games. And the gaming world has showed us that. For a long time, it was dominated by young boys, and that has changed. I was just reading, there's more women over 30 playing games than boys under 18 now. So, you know, the entire field has changed as we learn that there are other valuable aspects of the game mechanics, such as art and music and story and other ways of presenting the interaction that doesn't require violence. So at least from an educational and therapeutic perspective, that's our goal.
Why is that genius? What our brain that has?
Genius? Why is it genius? Well, I think that for every aspect of human performance, there's going to be extremes, right, at the end. And we see physical geniuses in a way, like Michael Jordan, and people that perform at a level that seems beyond comprehension compared to even professionals in that field. And you see it for the brain as well, that there are people that have the ability to perform, you know, right on the edges of the highest level. Usually, we don't always see that across every domain. So the brain being as complicated as it is, people that have genius level abilities might not have it across every other aspect of their brain, like maybe social interactions. And then, you know, it depends how you qualify it. Creativity is a very hard aspect and wisdom of how our brain operates to quantify, you know, the ability to make connections between seemingly disparate events and come up with innovative ways of looking at the world. But these are the qualities that lead to at least that concept of genius. So it's not my area of expertise, but we do see that every once in a while, even in the lab, of someone that we're studying in some aspect performs so much higher than their peers. And it has to do with, you know, brain networks and chemistry and all the complexities that lead to our brain to function, which we're only beginning to understand. As you can imagine, it's just a vastly complicated field. Do we have any more? Anyone else?
In order to develop the mature cortex, do we need to intake any supplements?
To develop the prefrontal cortex? Supplements. I'm not really an expert on supplements either. So when I read the literature, the supplement field is complicated by the fact that very often it's hard to control. Same thing with the nutrition space. I mean, clearly nutrition's important, but finding really, really carefully controlled nutrition studies are challenging in humans because you would have to control someone's diet in every way except one variable that you manipulate. So, you know, I think that in terms of developing the prefrontal cortex, which is critical for our development and for education, obviously, the best way is through interaction, or at least that's the way that we are interested in exploring. How you interact with material, with other people, with technology will have an influence on how that part of your brain develops. At least that's what our understanding is. And so which is sort of the main idea of education in the first place, right? It's to take a young mind that does not have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, and during those very formative years to create an environment such as a school, which guides their brain development along the path that society deems is the way they should go. And so, I think that the very core of education is to create an environment to foster the development of the brain and the prefrontal cortex in an optimal way. And I think that now that we have all this amazing technology around us, we're confronted with at least the concepts that there might be other ways of supplementing that development, and that, I think, is the core of what we're talking about at this conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Adam.